Trump, the former MI6 agent, and the president-elect's frayed relations with American intelligence chiefs. Good evening. The former MI6 agent who reportedly compiled the dossier, whose publication so ransacked Mr. Trump's pre-inauguration news conference yesterday, has left home and apparently gone to ground. Claims and counterclaims have washed back and forth during the day, along with charges of fake news and yet thickening detail of what may have happened in Russia some time ago. Tonight, we ask former US intelligence officers how confidence between their erstwhile agencies and Mr. Trump can ever be restored.
Also on tonight's programme, more than a quarter of a century late, files on 23 suspects in the Hillsborough disaster are passed to the Crown Prosecution Service to decide on charges. No more Brexit blues. Retailers, led by Marks & Spencer, had a cheery Christmas, but beware the hangover of rising prices. And painting lessons for all. One of the country's leading art colleges sets up a pop-up school at London's Tate Modern after complaining that art is vanishing from the classrooms.
And with cold Arctic air across much of the country and some places seeing some snow, I'll have the latest on what's going on now and through tomorrow, later in the programme.
There is still no sign tonight of the former British spy at the centre of the lurid allegations against the US President-elect Donald Trump. Former MI6 agent Christopher Steele, who's believed to have compiled the dossier, is said to be in hiding tonight. As for Donald Trump, he's continued railing against media organisations which have reported the salacious details, but has tweeted about an attempt by US intelligence bosses to make amends by insisting their agencies did not leak it to the press. Here's our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman.
Last night, America's most senior intelligence official tried dampening down Washington's biggest spying crisis since the Iraq War.
I think it's a disgrace. And that's something that Nazi Germany would have done and did do.
In New York, Donald Trump had accused his soon-to-be very own spying agencies of leaking against him. But later, Trump Tower took a call from James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, who told the president-elect he didn't believe the agencies had leaked and that they had made no judgment on whether the now infamous dossier was reliable. Trump's tweet this morning was almost conciliatory by Trump standards. James Clapper called me yesterday to denounce the false and fictitious report that was illegally circulated. Made up, phony facts. Too bad. The former MI6 officer who apparently wrote that report had fled from his home in Surrey today. Chris Steele, who is 52, has gone into hiding. And there was no reply from his office in London, Orbis Business Intelligence. Steele had co-founded the private investigation firm after leaving MI6 more than 10 years ago. Though from Steele's business partner, another former government official, there was this curious non-denial.
Do you stand by what was
I'm
published?
not going to make any comments at all about the dossier that is being spoken about in the press at the moment.
Okay. And can you confirm whether Christopher Steele was involved at all? Is his name?
I can't possibly comment on that at this moment in time.
The 35-page dossier is in fact a series of 18 intelligence reports written between last June and December. They were commissioned by Fusion GPS, an American research firm. At first, they were funded by a wealthy Republican opposed to Trump, and then by Democrats. And they make the unverified claim that Moscow had been cultivating, supporting and assisting Donald Trump for at least 5 years. Though from the Russian Foreign Ministry today, another denial.
То есть это полный отрыв от реальности.
This is so far removed from reality. This would be the same as saying that the British Queen was recruiting someone in a Moscow food store.
The most salacious and unverified claims are that the Russian Secret Service, or FSB, secretly filmed Mr. Trump with prostitutes in this Moscow hotel room 3 years ago. Compromat, or compromise, being an age-old form of FSB blackmail.
Does anyone really believe that story? I'm also very much of a germaphobe, by the way. Believe me.
Donald Trump wasn't bugged?
No.
Wasn't followed?
No.
Wasn't watched?
No, and if I'm not mistaken, he never had any business here.
The report also makes the unsubstantiated claim there was secret communication last year between Moscow and the Trump campaign, allegedly directed by Vladimir Putin himself. It was alleged Mr. Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, had met Kremlin officials in Prague, but Mr. Cohen says he's never been there.
I said, Mr. Trump, I have never been to Prague. He said to me, okay. I said, do you want to see my passport? I live close to the office. Right. And he said, yeah, you mind if I see it? And I said, of course not.
Mr. Trump yesterday accepted claims that Moscow did hack Democratic Party computers. And today his Pickford CIA chief suggested in his confirmation hearing that a Trump administration would stand up to the Kremlin.
Russia has reasserted itself aggressively, invading and occupying Ukraine, threatening Europe, and doing nothing to aid in the destruction and defeat of ISIS.
But if any of the dossier produced by Orbis Intelligence is true, then the Russians have information on Trump they could use against him, though not a single news organization, let alone US intelligence official, has verified any of its contents.
Well, Jonathan Rugman joins us now. What more can you tell us about Christopher Steele?
He was president of the Cambridge University Debating Society of the Union when he was a student. He went on into MI6. I've spoken to two former colleagues of his there. One described him as a very bright Russophile who had left MI6 unusually early to pursue a commercial career. Another described him as inept and not emotionally intelligent. But what both of them said was that Mr. Steele must have believed what he had written was true. I think there are problems with his report. There are no caveats in it, which brings back memories of the intelligence failures leading up to the Iraq War. He apparently worked through intermediaries. He wasn't able to go to Moscow himself to meet these people. He used Russian intermediaries instead. And the trouble for Mr. Steele is that his company took on a job which it really shouldn't have taken on, because Washington being Washington, this report was bound to come out at some point, and his cover as a former MI6 agent and the work of his company has been blown.
Well, briefly, I mean, trouble. Is there any trouble for MI6 in all this?
I think there is potentially trouble, because the reputation of MI6 rises and falls in Washington with the reputation of the CIA itself. And if President Trump, as he will be, doesn't trust the CIA, then why should he trust MI6? And I think it feeds into this narrative of people in the intelligence services being out to get Donald Trump, which, of course, erodes trust a great deal.
Jonathan Rugman. Well, now, earlier I spoke to the former Deputy Director of National Clandestine Service at the CIA, John Sarno. I began by asking him whether the intelligence community will determine now how the leak got out.
Well, I think it'll be an issue for the new president, once he's in office, to make that, whether or not he decides to make that a priority for the intelligence community. Quite frankly, given the somewhat speculative nature of the allegations and the fact that the president-elect has already dismissed it as either fake news or uncorroborated information, I seriously doubt it's going to be a major priority for the intelligence community after he assumes office.
Well, I mean, you've had plenty of years of experience, and you must have seen presidents come and go. Have you ever seen an event like last night?
No, I have to say that was completely unprecedented. Certainly made for great theater, but no, I've never seen anything in my years of experience.
Are you worried at the state of relations between the intelligence community and the incoming president?
Well, it's always a situation that's constantly in flux, and intelligence supports policy. So it's a question of the new president, every president, when they come in, they determine both the frequency, the duration, and the issues that the intelligence community will address for them. I think when he says that he respects the intelligence community, that he's being sincere, and that as the process works through in the early stages of his presidency, that the relationship will build into one of mutual trust and respect.
He has been talking, both in the campaign and indeed in these recent days, of a kind of approach to Russia that the intelligence community must be completely unused to.
Well, I think his issues with Russia, I mean, he looks at it, understandably, from a businessman's perspective, an international businessman. So he has had dealings with the Russians. And what he has said in recent days in terms of agreeing with the intelligence community that the Russians did somehow become involved with the hacking into the Democratic National Committee, But he also caveated that by saying it's not just the Russians. There are other countries that do it. And that's just a fact of life in the international environment.
If you were close to him in his intelligence entourage, would you have his Twitter account shut down and keep him quiet on that score?
That's an extremely excellent suggestion. I would certainly encourage that. But tweeting policy statements in 140 characters or less, I think, is not probably the best way to propagate those policies.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
That's John Sarno, former CIA man. But joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Courtney Weinbaum, a national security expert at the RAND Corporation, who spent 14 years in the intelligence community at the Department of Defense. Courtney Weinbaum, are you as sanguine as John Sarno seems to be about the state of relations between the intelligence community and Donald Trump? They seem to be pretty dire to us this side of the Atlantic.
They're challenging so far. We have to remember Donald Trump is not yet president. His inauguration is still a week away. And I think there are a lot of people who are in a wait-and-see mode. You know, let's see how things change when he's actually holding the office, when this is his intelligence community and these agencies work for him personally. And I think people are hopeful. They want to be optimistic and see, you know, what's going to happen once he finally takes office.
What do you make of this whole business? I mean, do you think it's damaging, for example, for US intelligence and British intelligence, given that they work extremely closely together? If something comes between us, it ain't too good.
I do think that it's damaging for a couple of reasons. First, anytime a president publicly says that he lacks trust in his own agencies, any agency, let alone an intelligence agency, it's gonna hurt the people at that agency. It's gonna make them think twice about their work in the future, about whether their work is valued, about how they should approach assessments in the future. That's one reason why it worries me. Another reason is we look at how this might impact international relations. Certainly information sharing between Great Britain and the US is one area where we could be concerned in the future, but there are hundreds of other countries out there, and the US has healthy information sharing relationships with many of them. And if any country or any intelligence officials in other countries have pause, they worry now maybe that they shouldn't, or they should think twice about sharing intelligence with the U.S. That could hurt the ability of the U.S. intelligence agencies to collect information in the future.
As a former intelligence officer yourself, do you think the intelligence community sleeps easy, thinking that Donald Trump will have a good enough team around him to ensure somehow that he comes to behave as other presidents have when it comes to intelligence?
Yeah. I really think that's an area where we're in wait-and-see mode. Today we saw the appointed director, the new director he appointed for CIA, had his confirmation hearing today. General Mattis, who's going to be appointed to Secretary of Defense, had his hearing today. We know the Secretary of State had his hearing, I believe, yesterday. So in these hearings, what's coming out in some of these questions and answers is precisely this topic. How do these officials feel like their relationships will be with intelligence, with information, with foreign governments? The future potential director of CIA said today that he has enormous faith in the intelligence officers and in the quality of their assessments. He thinks that their work is a very high quality and very rigorous. And so he's already publicly stating that he puts his trust in these employees. So I think that these employees want to see who their leaders are going to be and how their leaders value their work.
Courtney Weinbaum, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thanks, John. Well, it might have been totally overshadowed by the leaked dossier scandal, but Donald Trump has also declared that he's passing control of his vast business empire to his sons. That hasn't impressed his critics much, who say failing to divest all corporate assets and divert profits to a blind trust will break with 40 years of precedent. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris now reports.
These papers are just a piece of the many, many companies that are being put into trust.
There it was, laid out for all to see, the heaving desk of paperwork meant to symbolise Donald Trump signing over control of his real estate empire to his sons. But few who understand the detail of how a businessman president might avoid a conflict of interest were convinced. No blind trust, no divestment of ownership, instead a plan merely to step aside. Senator Elizabeth Warren says it's not good enough.
He, the president-elect, knows what will benefit him and his family financially. but the public doesn't. The only way that the American people can know that the president is working in their best interests and not in his own is if he divests and puts his assets in a true blind trust.
There were additional absurd details in the plan Mr. Trump unveiled yesterday. A promise the business would not profit from any foreign government delegations staying at Trump hotels, like the one around the corner from the White House. Instead, with their room service orders and dry cleaning bills, they would contribute directly to American government coffers. As Mr. Trump goes through the motions of disentangling himself from his brand, he's building his political empire at speed. Inside another jewel of DC real estate, the US Capitol building, Senate committees convene to consider the next chief of the Pentagon, the next housing secretary, and the next CIA chief, Mike Pompeo. In keeping with this turbulent week, there were strange goings-on. Just as the Intelligence Committee began to demand answers from their nominee over Russian interference in the presidential election, this happened.
That Russia, at the direction...
Well, if you're looking for a metaphor for dark forces infiltrating American democracy, this is the Senate Intelligence Committee, and someone has literally turned out the lights. Now, of course, it wasn't the Russians. But this is a time of rapid change, and there is an unease that accompanies that.
When the lights came back on, well, the Russians might have liked what they heard, that all their work is paying off.
Is Vladimir Putin and the Russians looking at all this and saying, we've done a really good job of creating chaos, division, instability in the American political process? That's what
I have no doubt that the discourse that's been taking place is something that Vladimir Putin would look at and say, wow, that was among the objectives that I had.
But it was in the dark of night that the most seismic and real political change occurred. Just as Donald Trump had promised, Republican senators began work on taking apart the nation's healthcare system limb by limb.
Up to 30 million Americans will lose their health care, with many thousands dying as a result, because you have no health insurance and you can't go to a doctor or a hospital, you die.
Democrats fought back, but they no longer have the power to prevent the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, the crowning glory of the Obama presidency.
You may have the impression that there are many fast-moving developments in Washington this week. You're not wrong. A new one is that now the Inspector General of the Department of Justice has just announced that he will launch an inquiry into the FBI and its handling of its inquiry into Hillary Clinton's email practices. This is certainly a disturbing development, I think, for the intelligence community here, which is certainly feeling rather off balance given some of the things that Donald Trump's been saying and the very public back and forth between himself and the CIA director. Most notably, it seems the probe will look specifically at the actions of Director James Comey and his last-minute revisiting of the emails issue, and certainly, you know, the allegations very late in the day that were made against her, allegations that Democrats believe may have well played a strong at least contributed to her losing the election. So a destabilising time, certainly, for the intelligence community.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Now, here in Britain, files on 23 individuals and organisations involved in the Hillsborough disaster have been handed over to the Crown Prosecution Service, which will now decide if criminal charges should follow. It's the result of 3 separate investigations into what happened and allegations of a police cover-up. But is it a step closer to justice for victims' families? Here's our sports correspondent, Kamian Zaram.
And now there are suspects and the very real prospect of justice for the families of the 96 Liverpool fans who died at Hillsborough in 1989. Report followed report, but it took until last year for an inquest jury to conclude their relatives were unlawfully killed and police negligence contributed to their deaths.
It's not only important to the Hillsborough families and the survivors, but I think it's important for the nation that to see these people cannot get away, especially with the cover-up that we've gone through. All of them years when all the evidence was there, it's important to the nation to see that people will be held to account no matter what public office they're in. They are no different than an ordinary member of the public.
It was Britain's worst ever sporting tragedy. and the largest investigation ever conducted into alleged police wrongdoing. To begin with, police blamed fans for the crush. But eventually, former South Yorkshire Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield accepted it was his actions that were the direct cause of the deaths of 96 people. The CPS are considering 23 suspects in total, but this process still has a long way to go.
We want the process to go ahead. I mean, there are a lot of families who are unhappy that this will take potentially another couple to 3 years. But my own personal view is that, you know, it has to be done properly and thoroughly. And if it takes 3 years, well, so be it. But obviously, it's a lot of pain and suffering for the families. And the quicker we can get on with it, the better.
The CPS will consider charges including gross negligence manslaughter, perverting the course of justice and misconduct in public office. Of the 23 suspects, 8 are under investigation for trying to hide police failings.
Kemi and Zeram reporting there. Now, it's one of Europe's most protracted disputes, an island divided for more than 40 years. But today, the new UN chief has brought together foreign ministers from Greece, Turkey and the UK at talks aimed at bringing peace to Cyprus and reuniting the island at last. Jane Dodge has been talking to people from both sides of the Cypriot community here to hear their hopes for future peace.
So this is a suitcase that we came over with in 1974 when the invasion happened. My mum got passage to London from my grandfather, and this is the suitcase that we travelled.
Mario Pischiris was 4 years old when Turkey invaded Cyprus. His family, Greek Cypriots, lived in a village in the north of the island. Here they are on the balcony. A few weeks after this photo was taken, Mario had become a refugee and a Turkish Cypriot family had moved into his home.
We lost everything, basically. You know, 1 minute they're there, just finished building their home and starting their life with a young family. I mean, it overwhelms me just now. Just imagine being told leave now and never being able to ever go back.
About 3 minutes past 6, 4 minutes past 6, and the first of the Turkish troops have landed in Cyprus.
Turkish troops invaded in August 1974 in response to a coup backed by the Greek government. ITN's John Nicholson was there as they arrived.
My name is Nicholson. How do you do?
Turkish troops occupied the northern part of Cyprus in 1974. A UN buffer zone was then created, separating the north from the south. 165,000 Greek Cypriot refugees fled to the south. 40,000 Turkish Cypriot refugees settled in the north. A new deal could see the area under Turkish Cypriot control reduced from 36% to 29%, and a return of some refugees on both sides. So after 42 years of division, are we close to a breakthrough and the reunification of Cyprus? The UN certainly hopes so.
We are facing so many situations of disaster. We badly need a symbol of hope. I strongly believe that Cyprus can be the symbol of hope of the beginning of 2017 in the world.
Foreign ministers, including Boris Johnson, joined the talks today. Britain still has 2 military bases in Cyprus. 35,000 Turkish troops are still based in the north of the island. Greek Cypriots want them to leave. Erkan Kamajdele wants them to stay. Born in Britain, his parents are Turkish Cypriots.
We want peace. We do want peace. We do like the idea of the whole unifying as one country, but we don't want to lose we don't want to lose Turkey as a guarantor of the Turkish people in Cyprus. I think it gives us a sense of security, feel safe. We'll always know that we'll be protected there.
There's a pipe dream and there's a reality, Jane, at the end of the day, you know. But if you're asking what my mum and dad would want, they would want to be able to sit on their veranda and, you know, say that they're home again. But I don't know if that's going to ever happen, to be honest with you.
Pipe dreams of a united Cyprus may well be some way off. The UN has warned there'll be no quick fix for one of the world's most intractable territorial disputes.
Here, the contest for the leadership of Britain's biggest union is being compared to a battle for the Labour movement's soul, as current General Secretary Len McCluskey accused his main challenger, Gerard Coyne, of trying to act like a dictator. Mr. Coyne published his manifesto earlier today, promising to strengthen the union and not play Westminster politics? Our political correspondent Michael Crick was at the launch in Birmingham.
Gerard Coyne's team invited 110 journalists to this bus garage in Birmingham today. 3 turned up to hear the man challenging Len McCluskey for the leadership of the Union Unite. And many Labour MPs hope Coyne's success would spell the end for Jeremy Corbyn too.
I personally think that we've spent too much time focusing on Westminster politics and not on you, the members, and making sure that the support that you receive is about protecting you in the workplace, improving your terms and conditions, and making sure that the union's on your side.
Launching his manifesto, Coyne accused Len McCluskey of being the puppet master of Labour Party politics. But behind Coyne's campaign, some suspect Labour Deputy Leader and local MP Tom Watson, who fell out badly last year with McCluskey, his former flatmate.
But isn't it you that's the puppet of Tom Watson, the stooge of Tom Watson?
Not at all. You've heard me say here that actually the issue is about getting away from being too obsessed with politics.
But you've been put up to this, haven't you, by Tom Watson?
If you think that Tom Watson is some puppet master in this, let me assure you of one thing. If I'm elected General Secretary of Unite the Union, I won't be sharing a flat with Tom Watson in the way the previous General Secretary did.
Tonight, Gerard Coyne and Len McCluskey came to address Unite members at a hustings in Derby.
A lot of Labour MPs seem to think that Mr Coyne is their last chance of toppling Jeremy Corbyn, because you're such a big backer of Mr Corbyn.
Well, you said it, so you're right. Unfortunately, Gerard has allowed himself to be captured by the hard right of the Labour Party, who want to use Unite's democracy as a political football in a proxy war against Jeremy Corbyn.
But your friends in Momentum are encouraging Labour Party people to join Unite.
And I can tell you that our members will be angry and they'll reject any outside interference.
But a third contender, left-wing activist Ian Allinson, could take votes from McCluskey and help Coyne.
Why aren't you going to ruin it for Len McCluskey and let Mr Coyne get the job?
Well, I think it's Len McCluskey who's triggered this election when none was necessary, which I think is just an affront to democracy in the Union, when members ought to be deciding which the direction of the Union is. And I think the reality is, rather than splitting the left vote, we should look at it as Len McCluskey and Gerard Coyne are splitting the establishment vote and giving an opportunity for members to actually have a change in the Union.
So the battle that's raged between pro and anti-Corbyn forces in the Labour Party for the last 2 years has now transferred to Unite the Union. And just as Len McCluskey and his colleagues urge Unite members to join the Labour Party to vote in those leadership elections, now people in the Labour Party, both pro and anti-Corbyn, are urging their supporters to join Unite to take part in this leadership election. Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Derby.
Patients waiting more than 4 hours in A&E, a target missed by almost every major emergency department in England, according to new figures. Plus, a record number stuck on trolleys, and that was back in November, so things can only get worse. NHS managers warned today the health service had reached a tipping point, calling for urgent intervention to tackle the crisis. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald is here. Victoria.
Well, John, we've seen over the past couple of weeks the pressure that the NHS is under, but these figures are showing that it was beginning back in November, a 42% increase in delays in discharging patients. Now, that means pressure not just in the NHS, but in the social care system, not being able to get patients out of hospital and back into the community. And in fact, all the key targets were missed in November. The number of patients seen within 4 hours in A&E was 88.4%. Now, that's meant to be 95%. 131 out of 139 major emergency departments failed to meet that 4-hour waiting time target. 54% more patients stuck on trolleys for over 4 hours, and trolley waits of over 12 hours. They reached 456, which was the second highest on record. So today I asked a chief medical officer whether they could see this coming in November.
It has been a busy winter and it's continuing. We've seen a 7% rise in attendances in our A&E departments over this winter and a 6% rise in admissions. So we've been prepared for January, which is going to be probably the most difficult month of winter, and we've put in some extra resources to try and deal with that. But we are coping, and we're very grateful to our staff for the fantastic work they're doing.
Well, the government's come under a heck of a lot of pressure this week. Any more today?
Well, the NHS Confederation, which represents managers across England, has today said there must be more funding across the spectrum in NHS and social care. This is adding to all the calls that we've seen over the past week. They also said that they had warned that a tipping point might be reached, and now they're saying that they're seeing proof that in some cases that tipping point has now been reached.
Victoria McDonald. Now, a correction to our report on Cyprus. We mistakenly named the veteran ITN correspondent Michael Nicholson as John Nicholson. I do apologise. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, some encouraging news for retailers at last, as new figures show there's been a boost in Christmas sales for some of the biggest names on the high street. Marks & Spencer had the first rise in clothing and household sales for 2 years, while Tesco, John Lewis and Debenhams also had encouraging festive results. So rather than doom, is a bit of a boom on the horizon. Here's our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy.
They're calling it Super Thursday, when the high street's big guns simultaneously reveal their Christmas earnings. It certainly was for Marks & Spencer's. Sales beat expectations after years of disappointments. And it wasn't just M&S. Tills were ringing across the high street. But is it the right kind of spending?
Today we heard from some of Britain's biggest retailers about how Christmas had fared for them. And across the board, the news was pretty good. From Primark to Superdry to Tesco to here at M&S. They all reported buoyant numbers thanks to the seemingly insatiable appetite of the British consumer to spend. Now, on the one hand, that's good news, yes. But on the other, it's also worrying because much of that spending is being driven by borrowing. And the problem with borrowing is the money has to be paid back.
Having paid down some debt during the credit crisis, us Brits are now back in spending mode. Borrowing on loans and credit cards now stands at £192 billion. That's 10% higher than last year, the fastest rate of growth since 2005. And when you add in mortgage borrowing, consumers owe a mammoth £1.5 trillion, the largest number on record. It's those figures that are making Mark Carney worried. The Governor of the Bank of England has highlighted consumer credit as one of the things now worrying him more than Brexit. That's because the fall in sterling is pushing up prices and could push up interest rates too. So the consumer could have a nasty shock in store. The John Lewis boss is also worried about the looming squeeze on spending. Although Sir Charlie Mayfield's partnership had a strong Christmas, he told me he's concerned about what lies ahead.
What I do see is that devaluation of sterling it's like the dog that's not really barked yet, and I find it, much as I would love to think differently, I find it quite hard to see how it won't have an impact of some sort next year. Don't know how much, but my view is that it could be material.
Yesterday, Mark Carney talked about his worries about growing consumer borrowing. Do you think that's a problem?
I guess what he's possibly also got in mind is that borrowing is okay when interest rates are very, very low. But if we do move into a part of the cycle where they start to rise, and I don't think that's in prospect any time in the very near future, but there is talk now, of course, of US interest rates rising and potentially rising faster than they were predicted previously. And over time, that will feed through into other economies, including ours.
So yes, it may have been a Super Thursday, but retailers shouldn't get too excited. It might be the last one we see for a while.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting. Now, freezing temperatures, high winds, the threat of floods and travel chaos. It's snowing across much of the country tonight. Our weather presenter Liam Dutton is in St Albans with more, but it doesn't appear to be snowing there, Liam.
No, it was snowing a bit earlier, Kathy, but it has tapered off now. But it really is cold and wintry here. Rain turned to snow here in St Albans a couple of hours ago. It's been repeated across a large swathe of southern England, stretching onwards towards East Anglia as well. But despite the snow falling at the tail end of rush hour, the roads have actually been moving, admittedly more slowly than they would normally with the snow reducing visibility, but things have certainly been on the move. But at Heathrow Airport earlier today, they preemptively cancelled 80 flights. That was to give themselves a little bit of flex to deal with this wintry weather as it moved its way through. Now, it's not just been southern parts of the UK that have seen some snow today. We've seen some snow as well into Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland, Northern England and North Wales. But even there, despite the snow settling on the ground, there have been no major problems. But whether you've had rain, sleet or snow today, the main concern tonight is going to be ice, and that's because the temperatures are going to fall to freezing or below. The moisture will freeze, so ice really is a significant risk through tonight and into tomorrow. A weather warning has been issued for that. Now, the next part of this weather story is the risk of coastal flooding for eastern coastal counties of England, stretching down from Northumberland in towards parts of Essex, and that's because there's a gale force wind in the North Sea pushing water towards the coastline, and that combined with high tide may cause some localised coastal flooding in those areas. At the moment, 51 flood warnings from the Environment Agency, 3 severe flood warnings as well, and the village of Jaywick in Essex is going to be evacuated tomorrow with a high water there expected around lunchtime. Back to you.
Thanks, Liam, and of course you have a weather forecast at the end of the programme. John.
Now, back to the man dominating tonight's news, Donald Trump, a man who's certainly made no secret about his attitude towards global warming. He's threatened to cut environmental regulations, while members of his transition team have threatened to review or restrict funding for climate change research. Our science editor, Tom Clark, has talked to US federal scientists who haven't spoken out publicly since Mr. Trump was elected.
I'm not a big believer in man-made climate change. I don't believe that what they say, I think it's a big scam for a lot of people to make a lot of money.
A lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay?
Imagine if your new boss told the world he didn't believe in the thing you've devoted your career to proving. That's how American climate scientists feel under President-elect Donald Trump.
We're sampling all of western U.S. from this site.
Scientists like Dwayne Kitsis, who year-round makes this journey to the top of Niwot Ridge in the Rocky Mountains. He works for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and helps maintain the record of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The location is deliberately remote. This station has to provide the purest sample of American air. It's about -30 with the wind chill.
Once a week, 52 weeks of the year, somebody makes the journey up here to 3,500 meters up in the Rockies to get a sample of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's just one of 100 locations where those samples are taken weekly to provide a continuous record of global warming gases around the world. I'm going to hook this up.
This sampling has produced a continuous record of greenhouse gases for decades and is shared with scientists around the world. As such, it's one of the most fundamental pieces of climate change research.
This particular site has been going since the early 70s, 1970s.
So how significant could it be if an incoming Donald Trump administration decided to close funding for a program like this? What impact could that have on the data, on the science that's been?
It would disrupt the long-term monitoring data that modelers use. How can you create policy based on a science if the science is stopping and starting? Any environmental science must count on long-term, reproducible results.
But America's federally funded climate scientists are watching what they say in public. Members of Mr. Trump's transition team have already criticised funding for climate change research. Down in Boulder is the lab that analyses the samples. The Dutch scientist who's run the programme for decades comes closer than anyone to challenging his future employer's statements on climate.
Anyone who says that man-made climate change is a hoax is so incredibly uninformed. It is known to be not true. It's a scientific fact. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that humans are driving this.
But Donald Trump won the election in part on the promise to cut environmental regulation and resuscitate the fossil fuel industry. Here's Scott Pruitt, his pick to head the Environmental Protection Agency, flanked by climate change denying Senators John Barrasso and Jim Inhofe, who are supporting his appointment.
Obama basically had put a sort of Damocles over the head of coal in particular, but in the long term, the other fossil fuel industries could see the gallows in the distance, and that is going to be repealed.
With fossil-fueled climate denial back in the political ascendancy, most environmental scientists can only guess what might happen under a Trump administration. But those at NASA have been given a clearer hint, a possible end to their work studying our planet. In this clean room at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, they're putting the finishing touches to one of the largest and most expensive satellites ever built, currently swaddled in a protective film for pre-flight tests.
So this is the James Webb Space Telescope, replacement for the legendary Hubble telescope that taught us so much about the origins of the universe. Now, there's not much doubt about the future funding for missions like this that look out into space. But now, with the election of Donald Trump, real concern about the satellites that look down on Earth. There have been hints from inside the transition team that the agency's Earth monitoring activities could be scrapped.
The Arctic is becoming warmer.
In its first TV interview since Donald Trump's election, NASA chooses to emphasize the strengths of what it does and how the world relies on it to understand an uncertain future.
How concerned are you right now about where you might be going from here?
I'm not that concerned. I'm really an optimist about this because I think people want the data. I think the politicians and policymakers, in the end, they want to know what's happening. It's important to understand what's happening. And so I believe that in the end, reason is going to lead us to more missions and more data.
Even if some of those politicians, your boss effectively doesn't, or says he doesn't believe that's where we're going.
Well, who knows? I mean, I can't predict what the future holds at NASA. I don't think anybody can. I believe in the end, though, that we'll continue to do what we're doing. I think we do it so well, you'd be foolish to get rid of it.
A hint of nervousness? You bet. In his previous job, President-elect Trump was both capricious and ruthless. Now he's about to become astronaut-in-chief. That said, previous administrations that have tried to overhaul NASA have struggled. It's not easy to cancel huge commercial contracts and fire federal employees. But budgets can be cut, and that can do serious damage to those measuring the inexorable change to our planet.
And now we've crossed this 400 ppm threshold.
Laurie Breweiler models the fate of greenhouse gases, the drivers of global warming.
It's unfortunate that people are choosing to disregard the science in some cases. We'll continue working hard, producing high-quality science, and hopefully over time people will come to recognize that climate change is an urgent problem.
So all US scientists can do for now is try to convince their new president of the value of their work and vow to continue, however heavy the weather. Tom Clark, Channel 4 News in Colorado.
Well, from the release of that dossier of Trump allegations to the president-elect's outraged tweets about the media, the methods and ethics of political journalism have rarely been under such a spotlight. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Eric Wempel of The Washington Post, and from New York, I'm joined by Vanessa Gazzari, managing editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, and someone who's written in support of BuzzFeed's decision to publish the dossier on Trump. Eric Wempel first. I mean, BuzzFeed has defended its decision, saying this is all about journalistic transparency. It was a spirited defence, at least, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, Ben Smith has made a rather committed defense of what's going on here. I happen to dissent from this decision in particular because there is very little guidance as to what is true and what is false in this document. It originated from political opposition research, which is a pursuit that really knows no standards whatsoever, or rather shaky standards compared to those of traditional journalism. And so I think that it would have been, okay.
Well, no, I just wanted to put that point to Vanessa Kazari. I mean, is this irresponsible that it's playing into Trump's slurs about fake news?
I do think it's really different from fake news, but of course, this document is not something that is verified, as BuzzFeed said in the story that it ran with the documents. Of course, Eric is right that there are a lot of issues around opposition research and what goes into it, and those should all be, I think they were pretty clearly set forth in what BuzzFeed presented, and they should all be discussed and weighed in terms of considering the contents of these documents.
Eric Wemple, BuzzFeed set out the caveats as it published.
Yes, I mean, they've carefully caveated the entire document, which is not carefully caveating. I mean, it was 35 pages, and they said, you know, there are a couple things we already know that are wrong, but here you have it. I mean, I understand the argument. The argument is that this is a document that the media elite has and that the top government officials have seen. So I understand the argument that, hey, you know, this is a public document, let's launch it. But I think that the provenance of the document in this case preaches caution, and that you don't simply go ahead and run the whole thing without before investigating. I mean, I think that the contradiction that BuzzFeed said was that they said, we will continue investigating the claims in this document. Well, why would you continue investigating them when you've just dropped them? Why don't you continue investigating them and then tell us what you think is right and what you think is wrong? Vanessa, I think that's a more defensible approach.
Vanessa Kazari, I mean, it's a slippery slope, this, isn't it? They've shoved the whole lot out there. And the problem is it's a new world now with the internet, and the mainstream media has had to follow up.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that there's a lot to suggest that this document was going to come out at some point quite soon. Not that that is, I mean, that's maybe neither here nor there. But to my mind, one of the real advantages of the document being published, and with the caveats, I mean, I would not have in any way been supportive of it being published as if it were, you know, real and verified, if that's not the case, and, you know, reporters haven't been able to pursue that. But that in this age of leaks and of crowdsourced reporting, this is actually a reporting method, to my mind. And I think that the news that we've seen...
You call it, sorry to interrupt, but you call it reporting, but isn't it just dragging journalism into the gutter?
Well, I don't see a document as being the same thing as a story. So I think that if you're going to write a news story and there's a sentence in that story that you can't verify, then absolutely it doesn't belong in the story. But I think that in this age in which there's like a tremendous amount of just content that gets dumped, whether it be from WikiLeaks or from any other source, and you know, I don't see why journalists and high-level officials of the U.S. government should have any special access to look at those documents unless, you know, they contain information that's really going to hurt someone. And I think, anyway, I think that, you know, that's a different question.
OK, let me put that to Eric Wemple then. This is different from a news report. It's a document rather than a report.
I don't see the difference. I mean, BuzzFeed has put its banner behind this document with some caveats that extend to a 35-page document. They said a couple things were wrong, and then the next day the Trump organization starts to refute a couple other claims in the document that seem to be flimsy as well. So what are we to believe and what are we to disbelieve? We don't have a lot of guidance on this. And I speak as someone who in the media, you know, BuzzFeed said, let Americans decide. How can I decide for myself? I don't have my own intelligence agency. I mean, I think the fact that this document is circulating at the highest levels of government, as CNN reported, is a very significant, real, and legitimate news story. I think they did a fine job with it.
OK.
But I think that BuzzFeed, OK.
I'm really sorry to cut you off there. We've run out of time. Eric Wemple and Vanessa Kazari, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
John.
After the break, we're checking out a new pop-up school at London's Tate Modern. If you can't get art education in the classroom, you can splash about in the gallery instead.
Welcome back. Now, art education is marginalised in classrooms and under systemic assault. That's according to one of the country's leading art colleges, which has set up a pop-up school inside London's Tate Modern. Staff and students from Central St Martin's are offering a series of classes to the public as part of a long-term project to introduce new audiences to art. So we sent Jackie Long along to enrol.
Welcome to This is an Art School. This is an automated service. Please enroll before proceeding.
Back to school. Today's lesson, is arts education under threat? And why does it matter? Discuss.
There's a systematic attack on it across primary, secondary education, gallery education, and it's really a chance to put a spotlight on what arts education can be and what it could be in the future if it's not throttled.
But, you know, we're a country that is trying to compete with the rest of the world. Doesn't it make sense for government to put the focus on science, maths, you know, these sorts of subjects?
Of course those subjects are important, but those subjects benefit from creativity.
Critics say the introduction of the English Baccalaureate in 2010, which measures school performance on core academic subjects, has added to a determined squeeze on arts in the curriculum, leaving fewer students taking it at GCSE. Latest figures show the number of entries for GCSE computing went up by more than 75% between 2015 and 2016. Engineering was up nearly 12%. By comparison, the number of entries for GCSE design and technology went down by almost 10%. Art and design subjects were down nearly 6%. The concern here is not that all students will turn their back on art, but that the ones kept out will be poorer students with little access to art outside school, a problem for an art world already criticised for being overwhelmingly white and wealthy. Terrain Brown from East London says he was the only black British student on his foundation course.
Art over the years has started to feel like a club, and society has kind of pushed it and formed it into this elitist thing. It looks elitist, so people are kind of dissuaded rather than persuaded to do it.
How easy did you find it to join that club, as it were?
Honestly, it was quite difficult. Coming from a background where art isn't something that's really pushed and really heavy, and the curriculum is very, very focused on kind of academic subjects that will get you a secure job and financially secure and that kind of stuff, you're kind of told not to do it a lot of the time.
And why does diversity in art matter?
If only white, well-off people did art, then everything would look the same.
Everyone here knows fighting their corner is hard at a time when the headlines cry crisis in the NHS. But they insist there is value in art for the nation's pocket as well as its soul.
There's an economic argument. There are the creative industries which are thriving here, but their lifeblood is young people coming through that do have knowledge, skills, experience with an art and design background. But I'd also say that there is a sort of a civic case to be made for it because, you know, the Tate collection is free, it's owned by the nation. Shouldn't we all be allowed to have access to it and it be part of our lives and part of our sort of enjoyment of life, not just the rich and privileged?
The government says it's investing £300 million over the next 4 years to help more school children get access to music and art, insisting also that art should be for all. The conclusion from students at the pop-up school, though, that's a vision that is some way off.
Inspired you to pick up your paintbrush?
Well, I do watercolours, but that's it from us tonight. We're back 7 tomorrow. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.